Good morning and welcome to the Global Communiqué's in-depth conversations, where we will be discussing the implications of the COVID-19 pandemic on climate change issues. Today, to help us unpack this topic is Mary Robinson, a climate justice advocate who is the former and first female president of Ireland, the former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and the chair of the Elders. Thank you for joining us today.
It's a pleasure, Mary Jane.
This year, 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic almost instantly upended normalcy for the entire global population. Economies grinded to a halt when lockdown measures were implemented in which human mobility, such as air travel, other transportation means reduced. Industries halted, leading to temporary air quality improvement in certain cities. The pandemic also saw investments in energy systems reduce, which has led climate activists to say this is the opportune time to invest in clean energy technologies as we seek to rebuild the global economy. As a starting point, let me ask you a general question on what your views are on the ways in which society collectively responded to the pandemic and what that says about tackling climate issues.
I think the way I'd like to answer that is by looking at the lessons we can learn from COVID-19. And the first lesson is that collective human behavior actually matters. It's the only thing that's protecting us from the virus. It's our willingness to comply with social distancing, washing hands, lockdown if needed, and so on. And the second, that lesson is important when we talk about addressing the climate crisis, which is still looming, because we're going to have to change our behavior. In the industrialized, richer parts of the world, we're going to have to consume less and produce less. We're going to have to change our habits of recycling and circular economy, or get rid of food waste. Even our diet will have to change considerably. So that's the first lesson, that collective human behavior can matter, and we have to encourage it in the context of climate. The second lesson is that government matters. There are countries that try to minimize government and have small government and all the rest of it. And we're actually going to see very visibly that governments that didn't address the health dimensions of COVID properly cost the lives, the health, the livelihoods of their people far more than governments that did. And I'm pleased to know, as I'm sure you would be, Mary Jean, that women-led governments have done quite well in addressing this. The third lesson is that science matters. And that's a really important lesson when it comes to dealing with the climate crisis. We're all very aware that ministers of government are side by side now with health experts in press conferences all around the world. And they're listening to the health experts, as they must, if they're going to be doing a proper leadership role. We have to listen to the climate scientists much more than we have been doing. And the second last lesson, the fourth lesson is that compassion matters. We're seeing a lot of neighborliness, a lot of awareness of people who are much worse off. And it's because we're all out of our comfort zone, but it's not a great leveler. Actually, COVID exacerbates the inequality, but we have more empathy because we're ourselves in a different place. And that is very helpful because it opens us to seeing also the climate crisis. And the last point is that when money really matters, it becomes available. We've seen, especially in the richer parts of the world, the solidarity packages that suddenly can become available. Why do we spend so much money on war weapons and defense budgets and not enough on health and education? That's another good lesson.
Tackled this COVID-19 pandemic, which has resulted in what they've been calling a twin crisis of a health challenge as well as an economic one. Is climate change policy incongruent to discussions of global public policy? And should the two be treated as fundamentally distinct issues, or are they actually congruent to one another?
I think we've learned that the climate crisis and COVID are very closely linked, because it's our lifestyles, especially in relation to wet markets and less space for wild animals, that led to previous pandemics like Ebola, like SARS, and now, unfortunately, coronavirus globally. And so that's the first point. And the second point is the health dimensions of the climate crisis across the board are very significant. The pollution that causes asthma, that kills so many, so we need to deal in a comprehensive and cohesive way with the health dimensions of COVID and climate, and not be in silos. The problem with big institutions like the IMF and the World Bank and the UN, as I learned, is that we very often treat things in silos. And that's not the way to do it. We have to make the connections. And again, I think COVID helps to make those connections.
Mm-hmm. And the reduction in air travel and economic activity that resulted in a temporary reduction in the concentration of nitrogen dioxide and carbon emissions earlier on in the year at the height of the lockdown measures came at a high human and economic cost, with many livelihoods lost. How can society create a sustainable economic system that both supports people's livelihoods as well as not harming the environment?
I think we all were aware that one of the immediate consequences of the reduction in activity because of COVID was that we reduced our emissions, and we all saw the cleaner air. We heard the bird songs. We actually communicated with nature more, and that was the one bright moment maybe in this COVID crisis. But that's not the way to reduce emissions. It's significant that it shows that we can do it. But of course, we also have to have an economic life. And therefore, it's extraordinarily important that we do it in a way that is beginning to emerge. Let me take the European Union as an example of reasonably good climate leadership at this point. There's a Green Deal, there's a strategy on biological diversity, there's a farm to fork policy that's better than the previous common agricultural policy, there's a just transition mechanism which needs to be expanded. It's more focused on just coal workers. Now that's important, in countries like Poland in particular that are very coal dependent, that as they come out of coal, the workers aren't the ones that are left carrying the whole suffering of that, but there are jobs provided. But I believe that we need a just transition that actually goes right down to people's transition at local level into a better way of coping with the climate challenge. All of these are what we need to do. I'm seeing in the Biden-Harris administration a similar approach, and I look forward to seeing how this will impact in America giving leadership again on climate, and that will help with China has committed to be carbon neutral by at least 2060. That was a big step during the UN General Assembly of the Chinese government, and now more recently both Japan and South Korea have committed to be carbon neutral by 2050. That's fine, but we need to know where countries are going to be in 2030 and 2025, not just 2050, which is too far away, and we need the specifics leading up to the COP in Glasgow next year, COP26.
Okay, and you've just mentioned the role of countries. With vast inequalities across different countries, is it fair and a strategic move to expect the same climate change policy response from all countries with varying needs, interests, and concerns? You also just gave Poland as an example, which is coal dependent. How can vulnerable countries, such as small island states, be supported in implementing a climate change policy response?
I think we have to understand what we mean by climate justice. As you mentioned, I'm passionate about the issue. I've been looking at it for nearly 20 years now. And I think there are about 5 layers of injustice in the climate context. And the first is the injustice that it's the poorest countries, the poorest communities, the small island states, the indigenous peoples who are affected first and disproportionately. And they're not responsible. I learned about climate change through the lens of human rights, working in African countries. The second layer of injustice is the gender dimension. that women's roles are different, especially in developing countries, the social roles. Women may lack land rights, may lack access to capital, and still have to build resilience in their community, have to put food on the table, have to go further in drought for water, etc. The third injustice is the one that young people and children have been reminding us of, the intergenerational injustice. They are right that they're not going to have a secure future unless we change. And they're calling us out and saying, listen to the science. The fourth injustice is a very subtle one, but I think you'll understand it. It's harder to persuade my part of the world of this injustice, but it's very real. The injustice of the pathways to development. Industrialized countries, we built our economies on fossil fuel. And now our responsibility is to wean ourselves off as quickly as possible. But what about developing countries? I remember before the Paris Agreement, I was the special envoy of the UN Secretary General on climate change. And I saw that in their intended nationally determined contributions, many developing countries said, we want to go as green as possible, but we will need the investment, we will need the training, we will need the skills, and we will need the know-how. And of course, we haven't seen that solidarity. And meanwhile, a number of countries, including in Africa, have found more coal, more oil, more gas. So what are they to do? The injustice is, if they go the dirty route, their people will be affected first. That's the injustice. But we'll all be affected because we'll use up the carbon budget. So it makes every sense to have that solidarity and encourage developing countries to go green, but also to recognize that there is within the system a sense, of the greater responsibility of those who have created more emissions. So they should be getting out of coal and oil and gas faster.
And also in the developed world as well, I know in France there was the Yellow Vest movement. And how can we ensure that also in high income countries in the West, for example, that socioeconomic divides are not made worse because of climate change responses by governments?
That's also a very important question. And it's all about the just transition that I talked about. As we go forward, we have to make these decisions, but they must be seen to be fair, which means that the benefit of those decisions must go to those at the lower income, those most affected. The Gilets jaunes, the Yellow Vest population were not anti the environment or anti-climate change. All they wanted was fair decisions. They had seen a wealth tax removed in France, and now there was a fuel tax across the board, which affected far more farmers, those living in rural areas, those without public transport. And so you had an outcry. Great care is now being taken to try to ensure that there is a dividend. And even, there is an approach now in the United States about carbon dividends that has bipartisan support, strong bipartisan support, and strong student support in universities in the United States. And my hope is that this could be one way of, even in a divided Senate in the United States, that legislation can be passed that will be important in that regard, but it will have to be perceived to be very fair.
And just going now to a new form of environmental issue, we have seen a newer form of environmental pollution with discarded single-use face masks and gloves ending up in the ocean. How is this new way to curb the spread of the virus also going to impact the environment?
Yes, it's a fair question. In many ways, COVID hit us unexpectedly and rather cruelly. So we had to quickly get the equipment, especially for health workers, and then for all of us to properly social distance, etc. And it was understandable in the short term that has increased the plastic. There is now a movement among a lot of countries to have a treaty to ban plastic use, to somehow more effectively reduce it. We certainly will have to. We'll have to find different ways of protecting ourselves that are not as damaging as the plastic materials that on the whole have been used. And it has greatly increased that form of serious pollution that gets into our oceans, into our waterways, affects wildlife, affects the food chain, and so on.
And the IMF has referred to a long ascent to overcoming the crisis and building a more resilient economy. Part of the recovery strategy that has been promoted by different experts is digitalization and strengthening technological connectivity. What do you think are the implications of digitalization on climate change, and are there possible negative side effects to digitalization on the environment?
Well, let's first of all look at the positive effects. I mean, take my own example, because I'm passionate about promoting the idea of the injustice of climate change and that we need to treat it as an urgent crisis. I was traveling far too much. I was flying to speak at events and persuade people. Now I can Zoom. I'm Zooming every day. And it means that when we come out of COVID, I won't be traveling anything like as much. I will only travel when absolutely necessary to do the convincing that can't be done on a screen, if I could put it that way. And there are a lot of people in that situation who are traveling too much, who need to reduce the travel. It's also helped people to be able to shop online and so on. It has implications. It has increased battery use, etc. And there's the waste element involved in that. But I think from now on, we probably will have much more hybrid approaches to large events rather than people gathering for large events. And that means reducing air travel very, very significantly. And this will be beneficial.
So still on the topic of digitalization and the use of technology in this current context, e-waste accounts for roughly 5% of global waste. Is it possible to replace e-waste with clean tech or clean digitalization as digital transformation becomes the order of the day?
Yeah, I think it is really important not to think that technology per se will solve all our problems. We have to also scrutinize the waste implications and the emissions implications of technologies. Because I'm an elder, this is not an area that I'm a great expert in, but I would encourage you to listen to a podcast that I'm a co-host of called Mothers of Invention. Have you heard of it?
No.
No. It's actually great fun as well, which I'm sure will be news to you and good. I'm doing it with another Irish woman, Maeve Higgins, who's a professional comedian based in New York. And for the last series, which we've just finished, that was our third series, we did it with Tamali Kodakara from Sri Lanka. So, a woman from the South. And particularly in the last series, we've particularly talked to women in the South of the United States, women in the South globally, with their solutions to the climate issue. And a lot of those solutions are nature-based, are very good, very high-tech in one sense, but actually it's being very climate smart, conservation, agriculture, saving the seeds, these kinds of solutions, rather than the digital tech. But in some cases, digital tech is used very effectively to be more nature-based. So it's not an either or, it's an intelligent use of.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. I think most of the time, especially when topics become quite popular or become catchphrases, I think digital and digitalization becomes kind of like a catchphrase rather than inculcating various solutions such as nature-based, like you're mentioning. So I'll listen to the podcast. That would be interesting.
Okay. I hope you enjoy it. There are some very funny pieces as well. If you're short pieces, they're mostly very funny. And our last episode was to imagine the future. So we imagined celebrating an election, and it was just at the time, it was released at the time of the American election. And people thought initially we were celebrating a Biden-Harris win, but we weren't. We were celebrating the second win of a woman president in the United States, following a woman of color, an indigenous woman had just won, so this was imagining the future. And then we were talking about the fact that streets had become so much greener, that people were using public transport only, and it was clean, and the air was clean. And, we imagined ourselves in that future, which we have to do much more.
Sort of pivoting from that point, the World Health Organization has found that environmental hazards cause roughly 25% of the global health burden. And in the context of COVID-19, it has become, and it was taken as an emergency from the very get-go because of its health implications. Do you think climate change is given adequate attention in public discourse as a necessary topic to engage with? Why or why not?
I think I live in a world where I wake up every morning conscious of the climate crisis, and most of the people that I'm interacting with are the same.
Mm-hmm.
We're all aware this is an absolutely urgent climate crisis, but we're almost in an increasingly large bubble. There are a lot of other people who are in the short term very preoccupied by COVID and have almost forgotten the climate crisis. So there is that danger. I'm glad to say that at the international level, there are opportunities coming up where there will be much more focus. For example, on the 12th of December, it's the 5th anniversary of the Paris Climate Agreement, and there will be heads of state making commitments and increasing the ambition of what they will do as governments. There'll be corporations saying what they'll be doing. There'll be cities saying what they'll be doing. And this is good. And then next year in November of 2021, we have the Conference on Climate in Glasgow. And that really is a make or break conference, because then we've got to know what governments and corporations and cities will be doing, not by 2050, but by 2025, 2030, and really showing us. And we're seeing big commitments. I mean, the Prime Minister of Britain said that they will be out of fossil fuel cars, if I could put it that way, by 2030. That's a big step. I mean, it was 2040, it's now come down to 2030. So we are seeing those kinds of commitments, but they have to be worked on in great detail. An awful lot of hard work has to be done to move us to this green economy with its green jobs, with its links with nature, nature-based solutions, reforestation, the whole way in which we need to understand the connections between our, I'm not sure if I mentioned, I think I stopped at the fourth layer of injustice and forgot the fifth layer, which is the injustice to nature herself, the loss of biodiversity and the extinction of species. So there are 5 layers, and that's the fifth.
Oh, thank you so much on that note of commitments by governments and the fifth layer. We will leave it there. Many thanks to you, President Robinson, for the insights you've provided on this topic of climate change and for joining us today as well. And to everyone watching, thanks for watching.
Okay, well, it's been a pleasure, and thank you for very thoughtful questions, and good luck in your future, Mary Jane. It's nice to have met you again, not as a student anymore, but as a fellow. So all the best.